a Mindfulness Wales Meddwl Gareth Cymru session before. Welcome to those of you here for the first time, and a very warm welcome to our special guest, Mark Williams. So this is one of a series of Zoom sessions we started during the pandemic, and we have been sometimes running them once a month. We actually haven't had one for a little while, but we've got a program starting from now, running through most of the year. So my name is Vishwapani, I'll be chairing tonight. And you can see some of my colleagues from Mindfulness Wales at the top left of the screen when we're in gallery view. And before I say anything about Mark, let's just start with a short period of meditation, which I'll lead. So finding a way to sit. Finding our stability. Giving ourselves time, space, and the intention to be really fully present. Perhaps we acknowledge or notice all the thoughts that inevitably the day has brought. Feelings. And then bringing our attention to the experience of being here. Taking this pause, this moment, to catch up with ourselves. To feel the body. Resting on this chair, floor. To feel the breath. Whatever key we have from our experience practicing helps us to be present. That helps us to settle. Giving ourselves space. And then moving into the transition, final part of the practice. Introducing movement and opening our eyes when we're ready. So having welcomed everyone to the session, I particularly want to welcome Mark. And it's really delightful to have Mark with us today for so many reasons. Now, look, I'm not going to give a potted biography of Professor Mark Williams. I think if you're in the mindfulness world in Britain, then you will know that he developed MBCT with 2 colleagues and wrote the books and got nice approval and Atlantic World and all of that. You'll know that. But I suppose, firstly, I want to express my own sense of gratitude to Mark for all of that we wouldn't be here in Mindfulness Wales, and I wouldn't have a job, frankly, etc., without what Mark, with colleagues, of course, but what Mark did with others. And so I'm really interested to hear where his thinking has gone more recently, what he's been choosing to put his energy into in developing, building on that work that's been done over the last 20 years. One other thing I want to mention, which is that this isn't just any mindfulness Zoom, wherever you may be zooming in from. This is Mindfulness Wales, and Mark Williams isn't just the best known British mindfulness teacher, but he is preeminently the best known Welsh mindfulness teacher, and that should not be forgotten. I tried to get Mark to speak about mindfulness in Wales, and I might even see if I can tease something of that out of him. And that was because I listened to one of his talks where he was talking about Welsh connections. So, Mark, if you want to make any of those connections, please feel free to do so. If you don't want to, that's fine as well.
Thanks, Bishop.
And with that, I'm simply going to hand over to Mark. I'm going to remove my spotlight until such time as we're moving into something more interactive where I need to be mediating with other people. And I'll simply hand over to you, and in the knowledge that we're in good hands.
Thanks so much, Vishwapani. Well, yeah, well, I wasn't planning to talk about my Welsh background, but I will say that I was born in Flintshire, in a place called Mancot, just down the hill from Harden. And that's where I lived for the first 4 years before moving to Aberystwyth. And then my family moved to England. And I stayed in England until I moved back to Wales in 1991 to the University of what used to be called the University College of North Wales in Bangor. And now University of Bangor, I think. It went through various changes, but now Bangor University, I think. And it's been such an important part of my life. Partly, my mother went to Bangor University for a year in the 1940s, where she did agriculture and botany. And I never knew where this place was, this mysterious place, until eventually it came out of my consciousness when they needed a clinical psychologist up there, and I applied and moved. And that was a lovely thing to come back to Wales after all these years. And then at that time, I was doing research on autobiographical memory and depression, mainly about developing treatments for depression, cognitive therapy treatments, and applying them as they've been developed by Beck in the States, applying them in in Britain, writing about them and how they worked and doing research on the mechanisms, particularly the memory mechanisms they worked on. But as you know, the story is told many times of how John Teasdale and I and Zindel Siegel decided that the main thing we needed to do was to look towards the prevention of relapse in depression, because most people take antidepressants, which are a lifesaver for many people. But if you come off them, even after a year or 2 or 3 years, your risk of relapse goes back to what it was before you started. And we were interested in the fact that cognitive therapy seemed to reduce relapse, even if you didn't carry on doing the therapy. What was the essence of that? And it seemed to me to us to be a decentering, a standing back. But how could you teach cognitive therapy when people weren't seeking therapy? Well, you could offer mindfulness, which we had learnt from John Kabat-Zinn was doing the same sort of thing, getting people not to take their thoughts so seriously. So, well, the rest is history, and I won't go over it. But I think what I would say is mindfulness has become very popular for many reasons and in many ways. As you, I'm sure, know, the enthusiasm sometimes outstrips the evidence. Then the evidence sort of catches up. But while the evidence is catching up, then the enthusiasm suddenly wanes, and there's a lot of unpopular things said about mindfulness, about it very dangerous. And then that mood passes, and mindfulness is again there taking its place until we have mindful everything. And that's not a problem. I think that people generally, when they use the word in popular parlance now, when they talk about mindfulness, it has a positive, I was going to say feeling tone. Yeah, it has a positive Vedana about it. At its core, mindfulness teaches two things, doesn't it? And it teaches us to regulate when we're dysregulated, a sort of a calmness. But of course, many things we can do to calm down. And many people say, well, running is my mindfulness, or sports is my mindfulness, or pottery or art. And that's really lovely that people find an awful lot of ways in which they can find a way of calming when they need to calm. But of course, mindfulness isn't just about calming. People say, well, running and these are things I might, because I managed not to have to think of anything when I'm doing my pottery or my art. And that's also lovely. It's a way of keeping at bay the world for a while and transforming it to some extent when you keep it at bay. But there's something else that mindfulness does, which is this insight piece. So mindfulness teaches calm. It teaches us to regulate in a way, body and mind, but it also teaches insight. At the heart of the insight it teaches is how to relate to the mind as it comes and goes, how it shows itself to be impermanent even when we want it to be permanent. And that, of course, needs training, specific training. And that's what a mindfulness 8-week program does. It teaches us to calm, but it teaches us insight, decentering. But what we learn on an 8-week course easily dissolves in the sense that 8 weeks is not a very long time. The world continues to teach us other things other than being calm or decentered. And we can end up longing to recapture that sense of moment by moment clarity that we might have found on a course or on a retreat. And so people often ask us, is there anything else I can do to sustain or extend or deepen my practice? And of course, we do invite people to all days. We do invite people to go on retreat. But we wondered whether something that we had been teaching on retreat which people were finding helpful, might also be part of a mainstream mindfulness practice. Because there's one aspect of mindfulness in which I became fascinated a few years ago, which I think can help us provide a gateway into a deep dive into mindfulness. And this is feeling tone, or Vedana, as it's called in the Buddhist text. And this is how much as our unconsciousness crystallizes into consciousness, how much when we first become aware of a contact with body or mind, that first contact is pleasant or unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant. So that is, in essence, what Vedana refers to, this feeling tone or affective tone of an experience. And that's what we've been investigating. One of the interesting things that when John Kabat-Zinn and John Teasdale and Zindler Siegel and I were writing a book that subsequently became known as The Mindful Way Through Depression, took a long time to write that book, and there were 4 complete books that we wrote before that one was actually the one that came to the surface. And originally we had a chapter called The Feel of Things, which was going to be about feeling tone. And then we decided to drop it because we wanted every chapter to have a meditation that would be part of MBSR MBCT. MBCT is what the book was about. And there wasn't a meditation which specifically referred to feeling tone, to the feel of things. And so that chapter was dropped, bits of it were scattered throughout. And yet, if you go on a retreat on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you will do, if it's a 4 or 5 day retreat, 7-day retreat, you'll do at least a day, which is specifically on feeling tone. There are meditations that we learn on retreat. How can these be put into a mainstream course, perhaps as a follow-on course for us after MBSR, MBCT? So to give a feeling of feeling tone, maybe I could invite you now to look around the room where you are. You can turn your camera off or leave it on if you wish. Just look around the room at objects and around that you can see around you. And as you look around, just notice whether the objects that you're seeing feel pleasant or unpleasant or somewhere in between. I'll give you just 30 seconds or a minute to look around. If it's difficult to tell, then just let your eye move on. So don't go hunting for feeling tone. Just see if the pleasantness or unpleasantness is made manifest as your eye alights on different objects. Okay, so now, it may be that some things your eye alighted on were pleasant. Maybe just put in the chat a single word if you don't mind sharing what's in your room with others. Feel free just to put in the chat something that your eye alighted on that felt to you pleasant. And we'll watch the chat fizz past. Yeah. Plants, flowers, photo of your children, Mother's Day gift, a thank you card, flowers, a china parrot, a mandarin, a dog, a pet dog, get well card from a friend. Yeah. A pebble painted by a daughter. Picture cushions, painting from a friend, a family photo. Glass swap, tree-like silhouette, glass ceiling light. Yeah. And these, in a sense, are unique to us, aren't they? I mean, you know that other people might not have the same feeling towards them, but of course, part of it is because some of them are inherently beautiful. Sometimes it's the memories that they bring to mind, yeah, and they have a history. We have a history with them, or what they depict, or what they mean, and the faces on the screen and fish and chips as well. Says Gareth, thank you. And now it may be that some of the things you saw weren't so pleasant. I mean, I'm looking at a tangle of wire here on my desk where all the wires converge in a bit of an untidy tangle. Maybe one day I'll get around to untangling them. But now put it in the chat now for a moment. If there's anything your eye alighted on, if you don't mind putting it in, that didn't feel quite so. It might be a book, traffic regulation sign, says Nick. Thanks, Nick. Cold fireplace. Messy shelf, creases in curtains, bright light, dead leaf, clock, pile of paperwork. Oh, yes, camera stand. Partners IT. Your phone. A mess. Things that need to be put away. Absolutely, that's reminded me of things I need to put away as well. COVID test boxes, messy desk. Yeah, messy pens, bright street lights for Catherine, for Nick and Catherine, untidy and clutter. Absolutely. And again, it's interesting how many of these things too have their own history, and they are important or unimportant to us for various reasons, which can be very unique to us. Thank you. And the clock, says Gareth, because you got to leave early. Okay. So thank you for those. The sense of the feeling tone, you may have noticed that you probably didn't have to think too hard about some of those things, that it's just a sort of a felt sense. They're pretty simple, so simple that they're often passed over really quite quickly. And certainly in a mindfulness course, they're implicit. We talk about the reaction to pleasant and unpleasant, how we become attached to things, or we are trying to push away other things. So we do major on attachment or aversion, which is the reaction to feeling tone. We have the pleasant and unpleasant event schedules. And yet we don't swing all our awareness towards this feeling tone. And yet the feeling tone stands at the very tipping point, that point before we react, before there might be a cascade of reactions in one way or another. Now, we have no control, at least short-term control, over these feeling tones, and they're not predictable. They're not in any way rational. Sometimes they can seem predictable, but the same thing can create a pleasant feeling tone on one occasion, but maybe an unpleasant feeling tone a few moments later. Or chocolate. I mean, for example, you might like chocolate and you might say, well, that's definitely pleasant. But if you've just eaten a huge meal and you're just completely full and somebody said, opened a big box of chocolates, then maybe it wouldn't be so nice. The past conditioning now of what it's like to eat a chocolate when it's full, when you're full now, that current context means that something that would normally be pleasant is unpleasant. Now, the thing about feeling tones, if they're not seen, they push and pull the mind in this direction or that. But seen clearly, the feeling tone can be sort of allowed to take its natural course and can produce a great sense of profound equanimity and balance. And we can get enormous insight into the workings, extra insight into the workings of our mind, available to us by sort of going upstream instead of just sort of sitting at the side of the river watching our thoughts and feelings go past. We just go upstream a little or look upstream a little to see the very first moment when we feel a sensation or a thought comes into the mind, or we become aware of it anyway, where we wake up. And at that point, we say, so what's the feeling tone of this? Well, I'll come back later maybe to that, because we'll do a meditation which illustrates how we can apply what we've just been doing around the room for external objects to the internal objects of mind and body. But I think it's worth saying one thing, and then maybe we'll have a couple of questions and then move on. And that's the science that informs. If we want to do something on feeling tone, we have 2,500 years of history to help us, and meditation's born of that. But we also, of course, have our advances in science, and it so happens that advances in neuroscience over the last 10 or 15 years have informed how we can relate to the mind and how we can understand feeling tone in rather new ways. There's a new area of psychology called predictive coding, which is showing us that our experience of the world, of both our own experience, the world outside, and what's going on in mind and body, is based on what the mind predicts will happen based on past learning and current context. It relates partly to what we now know about the default mode network, this network which was discovered in the scanner, in a brain scanner, which is active between tasks. I mean, it used to be thought that what was happening in the brain between the tasks that you were asking people to do was pretty irrelevant. And the most important thing in the scanner was to get people to do a task and then do a control task. And then you subtracted the activity in the brain happening in your active, say a memory task or attentional task, from what was active in the brain when you were doing your control task. That allowed you to see the critical regions of interest in the brain that were thought to be responsible for that aspect of attention or that aspect of memory. And then you give your participant a rest, 5-minute rest, and setting up the new experiment, then you do another experiment and so on. And the bit in between, when people were resting, all that material used to be thrown away. Then people realized that during those rest periods, the brain didn't stop, that it went into a sort of default mode in which there was lots of activity in the medial area of the brain, sort of washing from front to back and back to front. An area of the brain often involved with things like self-related thoughts. That was constantly active, and it's now seen as hugely important. It's called the default mode network. So it turns out the nervous system is not passive. It's not waiting for a stimulus to bring it to life. And it's like other organs in the body, it's constantly active, like the liver and the heart and the lungs. The brain is constantly active, even when we're not paying attention. And Lisa Feldman Barrett, in her books, How Emotions Are Made, I've sent in a resources sheet which will be sent round to everybody. So her book is referenced there. She says, well, what is the default mode doing? Her answer is it's predicting what is likely to happen using imagined scenarios, counterfactuals. It's a sort of building mental models of the world around us and inside us, and also determining what action we should take to guarantee that all our resources, body, mind resources, should be balanced. Now, this is critically important because if our experience is based on predicting what's going to happen, and then it's important to know that our predictions are affected by feeling tones. So all our perception of the world, our prediction of the future, our feeling about the past is affected by the feeling tone that's happening right now. So the deepest habits of our conditioning are summarized in the feeling tone that occurs now in relation to objects that occur in mind from outside us and inside us. So I can talk about the program itself, but I'm going to pause there and see if there are any sort of questions that come up even now that, or things I've said which are just a little bit weird or difficult to comprehend and so on. So I'll hand back to Vishwapani and see if any questions are already coming in or, yeah.
Well, I have a question of my own. So why don't I ask this, and that'll give time for everyone else to maybe ask them questions. But my question is, you said earlier on that you'd become really fascinated by feeling tone. And my impression was that came from that experience of retreats,
yeah,
which you were talking about. So I'm interested to hear what that process was for you. How did this come to be? How did you experience feeling tone?
So the first thing, I was intrigued by its lack, i.e. I thought, here's a really important thing theoretically, but not part of our 8-week program. So that was a sort of, and I didn't really investigate that. I just sort of left that hanging. Then about 3 years later, after that book came out, I was on a Foundations of Mindfulness retreat, 7-day retreat. And we spent a whole day doing nothing but focus on feeling tone. And what was intriguing there, the realization that there were things you could do to make this little tiny evanescent thing that came and went very fast, to make it, to become aware of it. And that this happened so close to the presentation of the object itself, a sensation or a thought, and was so determining of what happened next, that for me, hanging around at that point seemed really intriguing and insightful, and releasing a sense of focusing on the gap between the feeling tone and the reaction, the attachment aversion, and seeing that gap opening up wider, and then realizing the impermanence of what had happened. So that was, I think, for me, that was the critical thing. And also the sense of allowing feeling tone, about letting it speak its voice, have its time, rather than immediately, if something was negative, getting into the grasping of the need to push it away, or the grasping of the need to make it stay.
So what I'm hearing you describing there, Mark, is identifying a number of stages in the process, and really exploring and experiencing that for yourself. So that there is this feeling tone, then that there's a gap, or rather, if we potentially there's a gap when we bring awareness, and then there's the reaction, or the way that we act on the feeling tone. And so what happened when you experienced that gap more fully?
A dissolving of the obsessive thinking that had been preceding that. So a sense of just so the sort of the sense of being caught up in something just dissolving without having to work at it. So it's like that sense of just receiving, oh, this is really interesting. The sense of I don't have to work to put this rumination to bed. There is something, and we talked about not feeding the rumination, and there's a lot of things we say in our mindfulness courses and that we practice about not feeding it, but this was experience it in new depths, to allow the feeling tone to be just as it was, rather than to sort of take it for granted. Everybody knows that rumination is unpleasant, or everybody knows that a daydream can be very pleasant and stuff like that. So but it's pausing long enough for the simplicity of the feeling tone to show itself, and then finding that whatever was spinning my mind round and round and round didn't have to slow down. It just stopped.
Okay, right. So we've got this, and I must say I've experienced that sort of thing myself. I think with a prolonged experience of meditation, you recognize it, and that's a key to something. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'll just read them out. I wonder if some of the things that you'll be going on to might be the way to answer the questions. But isn't the feeling tone we perceive from objects a construct of our ego self, where this feeling is qualified by experience? Should our goal be one of a joyful sense of connectedness with all people and all things, a sense that precedes good or bad tones, achieved by being aware of being aware? So there's quite a lot of thoughts in that question, but maybe the heart of it is, what is our goal? Is it a joyful sense of connectedness?
I would say yes. However, I think the joyful sense of connectedness is like a fruit rather than a goal. And a fruit can't really be forced. So I could stand in my garden by my tree and sort of say, right, what I want now is for this thing to flower so it gets fruit. But there's somehow And there's lots of things that might or might not determine that, but ultimately I've got to actually do the hard work of the gardening, and the garden needs specific work. So I think the joyful sense of connectedness as a goal is probably too abstract for many of us. And if you're depressed, actually, it's also very aversive. Connectedness is not often, it might be what you need, but it's not it. But if you can torture yourself by thinking, I wish I had more connectedness and I wish I had more. So yes, but the route to it in a mindfulness course is, from my experience, is to work on those things that are preventing us seeing the possibility of joy. And I will come to joylessness if we get to it, which is one of the features of week 7, about by trying to understand what does the mind do which creates joylessness, because there are very well-known mechanisms that it's good to understand, and by understanding it we can sometimes let go of the things that are preventing us from having slightly more joy in our lives.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I'll read a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Again, I think it may or may not be a matter of answering them.
Okay.
But let's just see.
Okay.
So Philip says, I'm struggling, please forgive me. If my eyes are like in a tangle of wires, I think untidy and feel frustrated that it's there and needs sorting. That gives me a negative sense. Which one is the feeling tone? Or is it something else? Okay.
Great.
So then there's another question. How does feeling tone differ from naming or labeling emotions? Is it the subtle space before the emotion becomes apparent?
Yeah. So let's take that one first. It is the subtle thing before emotion becomes apparent. Yeah. So it's the very, very first thing that happens when contact happens prior to an emotional forming. Of course, it might be determined by a current emotion that you've got preceding. So a loud noise, for example, if you're feeling very, if you're watching a horror movie, a loud noise can be more aversive than it might normally be, because you're in a context watching a horror movie. And so you're more startled by it, and it'll have a more unpleasant feeling tone. But the subsequent emotion after that comes after that feeling tone. So yeah, so it's the thing about the feeling tone is it's really simple. It's just one dimension of pleasant to unpleasant with neutral somewhere in the middle, okay, or neither pleasant or unpleasant in the middle. And in relation to the first thing about the tangle of wires, yeah, all of those things are potential feeling tones. In other words, feeling tones happen very fast. So you see the tangle of wires, you might not like the sight of it, negative feeling tone. You might think, I need to tidy those up. I need to tidy those up, negative feeling tone. Okay. It'll take time to tidy up, and I haven't got time to tidy up, negative feeling tone. In other words, both the seeing of them and your reaction to it also has a feeling tone. So feeling tone isn't just something happens, then you have a reaction, but the reaction itself has a feeling tone. And so they happen very fast. We're not going to catch them all. And of course, we might be sitting in a warm room, so the body might be feeling generally pleasant, and yet the sight can be unpleasant. So there can be different levels, different feeling tones at the same time. And all we do in practicing this is pick one to work with. So if you get a multiplicity, just pick one. That's enough for now, and work with that.
Okay, I have a comment.
Go for it.
Which is that this is how I understand it, Mark. Tell me if I'm getting this wrong. What we're doing is we're breaking down this lump that we call experience. And, for those of us who are familiar with mindfulness, we think about body, feelings, and thoughts, and maybe intentions as well, or impulses. And this is a slightly different way of breaking down experience into a sequence, the chronology of how we get to whatever label we might give the experience, like being fed up or being happy or something like that. And so what you're describing, I think, is something quite subtle, and that may be where the experiences come from. You may disagree that this is subtle, but that's perhaps why it's something that you can experience quite fully on retreat.
Mm.
And it's just something very simple at the beginning of what might become quite a complex, even an overwhelming emotion. And so it's really about isolating the bit right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Now, have I got that right? I don't want
You
to.
have, absolutely.
Right.
And it's very difficult to isolate, partly
Yeah.
because it sometimes is subtle, but sometimes it seems too obvious. So, for example, as part of what we teach, and you're quite right, because it's subtle, it comes out in retreat. It can be taught in retreat. And the challenge for us was, can you teach something on retreat as part of a mainstream 8-week program? What would you have to do? What experiences would you have to offer to people on a week-by-week basis that would allow them to do that subtle work by themselves without the retreat experience? And how would you prepare people? So we prepare people with 2 weeks of not focusing on directly at feeling tone, not naming it as such anyway. And maybe I'll come to that preparation in a moment. But then when we do get to feeling tone, there's a week of just experiencing feeling tone and doing virtually nothing else, but zooming in on the feeling tone of this, feeling tone of that, in order to tune people into it. And then there is a week of allowing the feeling tone by saying it's okay to like this, or it's okay not to like this. And the reason for that is that we can easily believe that the content of our mind, the content of our memory, or something that's happening to us is what drives our emotion. But actually, the content, let's say you have a memory of a disagreement with a friend a year ago and you never quite made up, but that memory keeps coming back to you. And the intention may be, oh, I should do something or whatever, but I haven't got around to it yet. I don't feel like it yet. When that argument comes to mind, we can believe that the argument is driving the rumination. Well, that's true in a sense, but I want to suggest it's the shell, the spiky shell on the memory, and that's the feeling tone. And we don't like unpleasantness, and we want to resolve it, and that's what drives the next. Now, why do we say that? Because actually there will come a time, maybe if you talk to a therapist or a good friend who will say, you know what, that person's had lots of arguments. They're always having arguments. And suddenly you feel better about it. You still remember the argument, but now it doesn't have that feeling tone. And when the memory occurs to you, it doesn't create that. So, therapy wouldn't work, or talking to a good friend wouldn't work, or mindfulness wouldn't be effective if memories could not be transformed. What is the transformation? The transformation, I think, happens in the ability or the nature of memories to create a ruminative cycle, a brooding cycle, a worry cycle. Okay. And to get you into problem solving mode, in sort of doing mode on the stuff. And by saying, actually, it's natural not to like this, is a way in which outside of retreat context, you can practice doing something to stay longer with the feeling tone, to see it more clearly, and then prevent the ruminative cycle from starting up.
Excellent. So that's so you've, right, let's not go into more questions, because okay, we could probably, at this point, halfway through our session, continue and have a theoretical discussion for the rest of our time.
Yeah.
But I have a sense that you're wanting to share with us different ways that we can engage with this idea of feeling tone, which you clearly have identified as something very important. So shall I hand over to you again?
Okay.
And I just want to acknowledge the questions we haven't touched on.
Okay.
That's just, there will be questions we don't get to.
Okay.
Let's move on with the workshop and see what happens next.
Okay. So, well, maybe we could just do a short meditation where I want to sort of share with you the way that this course prepares people to move in close to this tipping point, because we're going to be moving in close to what we are arguing is the things that contain all the conditioning history. Then we have to be kind to ourselves. And the first thing we ask people to do is to choose an anchor to find your ground, as it were, very much influenced by David Treleaven's work on trauma-sensitive mindfulness. Going beyond the breath, the breath is still there, but the breath for some people isn't a strong enough signal to ground themselves, to anchor themselves when the mind is very distracted. So I'm going to do a short meditation in which we offer other anchors, which may be very familiar to you to all, and then to move to the other way in which we can handle distractions, which is to begin to befriend the mind by not rushing back to the breath or our anchor when if we find our mind has wandered, but by taking a pause, rather than, because Vishwapani referred to taking a pause in the opening meditation. Yeah, we take a pause and we, at that moment, see if we can realize with the mind wandering how amazing the mind is, even if what it brings us is horrible, that we couldn't easily get by without the very processes that are creating the mind wandering, which is memory, imagination, planning, daydreaming, creative thinking. And therefore, the mind wandering is an opportunity to learn what we have to learn, decentering, yes, recognizing the mind's gone, but also to bring kindness then and there to the mind, to celebrate things. So let's just do a 4 or 5 minute meditation in which we find our ground in this way. So just taking our seat and allowing ourselves to notice the body, the entire body sitting here. Breathing. Perhaps noticing the weather pattern in mind and body right now. Whether we're alert or tired, restless or calm, whatever it is. And then at a certain point, gathering our attention and allowing our attention to focus on the feet. Maybe contact with the floor through the soles of the feet. Sensations in the toes, in the heel, top of the feet as well. See if it's possible to be open to the whole field of sensations, which we call feet. What's changing? What's most prominent? What's in the background? Then at a certain point, taking a deeper breath, and as we breathe out, shifting our attention to the contact with whatever we're sitting on. Noticing the sensations here. And what's changing here, if anything? What do we notice? Maybe pulsing or vibration. And taking a deeper breath. And on the out breath, letting go of the contact with seat and letting the attention come to your hands. What sensations are here when our attention arrives? Maybe the hands resting on the lap or on each other. Vibration or tingling in fingers or thumbs, backs or the palms of the hands. And then taking a deeper breath. And on the out breath, letting go of the hands and allowing the attention to come to the breath. Perhaps one place where you feel the breath moving, or the whole breath. And settling in here for a few moments. And now either staying with the breath as your anchor for the rest of the practice, or if you choose, moving back to contact with the floor through the feet, contact with the seat or the hands, and choosing to make those your anchor for this practice. Just making a choice now. And when you've chosen, just remaining in this place, just abiding here, open to all the sensations gifted to you from this place, moment by moment. It's usually not long before the mind wanders away from where we'd intended it to be. And if you find this happening, instead of coming back quickly to your anchor, breath or feet or seat or hands, just taking a pause when you notice the mind has wandered, noticing where it went, and then seeing if it's possible to appreciate there and then what the mind is trying to do for us, remembering things for us, planning things for us. Sense of perhaps even wonder or awe at what the mind does. And then when you're ready, slowly coming back to where you'd intended your attention to be, on the feet or contact with seat or hands or breath. So if the mind wanders, taking a pause, acknowledging where it went, thanking the mind, and then coming back. And then when you're ready, beginning to move fingers and toes, allowing your eyes to open if they've been closed, and taking in the room again. So maybe just for a moment, if you wish to gather your thoughts and reflections and experiences there, maybe put in the chat to start with, what did you find you chose for your anchor? What did you find? Did you find yourself choosing the breath or what did you find? Hands, breath, heartbeat, feet. feet and hands. It's perfectly fine to combine them. The feet always works for anything. Yeah. The breath, the weight on the seat. And sometimes it's really interesting, if you've done mindfulness, or sometimes you've probably explored these things quite a lot, hands on stomach, Gwen says, and the feet. But it's interesting how other people feel locked. They feel a bit disloyal if they go away from the breath. They think, oh, really the breath is what I should be. But actually, of course, the breath is complicated for some people. They might have panic attacks, or during COVID, it was very difficult. And in any event, it doesn't provide a very strong signal sometimes. Whereas the hands or the feet sometimes provide a stronger signal that you can come back to. And then, just while we've got the chat open for another minute, how did you find it, if at all, to thank the mind, to cultivate a sense of gratitude for the mind in that moment? Just to take the pause and to, rather than just coming back straight to the breath. Confusing, yeah. Good, unfamiliar, nourishing, pleasantly surprising. Smile, Anne-Marie. Or, yeah, compassionate relation to the mind. Difficult to do, yeah. Thanks, Charlie. It's interesting that from the point of view of the difficulty, sometimes it feels like you're losing control a bit, because if you've meditated for many years, you might have become very good when the mind wanders at knowing that it's wandered very early and coming back, sort of flipping back. Nick says, like a friend, yeah. Absolutely, that you flipping back to the breath. And the danger of flipping back to the breath, it's a great skill and you're not going to lose it. Yeah, so Judith was talking about how it's easy to get cross with yourself and judgmental about, and how it felt really good to actually say, no, actually, this is what the mind does. This is what it should be doing, as it were. And as we said earlier, it's working in the background all the time. The brain is never stopped. So it's going to revert to planning and thinking and daydreaming and creativity and remembering and bringing you stuff you haven't yet completed. And when it's brought you the emails you haven't yet sent from the last day, it'll bring you an email from last week or 6 weeks ago. Suddenly, do you know this feeling of suddenly in the middle of your meditation, remembering that there was an email you hadn't sent maybe a month ago? A really amazing thing. Now, we can get really annoyed in our meditation for that, but isn't that extraordinary the mind does that? Anyway, and Nat talks about easier to thank the mind for this. Yeah. Well, thanks for those comments. And I just want to go on and say how then we use the gap in part of the feeling tone. Then maybe we can take another couple of questions, and then I'll do a feeling tone meditation with you, which focus on both on feeling tone and on the sense of allowing. Before I do, though, I just want to talk about the way in which very often when we have a positive feeling tone, the traditions, and even in our book, we talk about how easily it is to get attached to positive things and how easy it is to get sort of pushing away the negative things. But what we realize when you get tuned into feeling tones, and this can be a bit unsettling, is that sometimes we find we're nursing our anger. We're not pushing it away at all. We're keeping it alive somehow. But probably more commonly, our relation to the positive is not as simple as just getting attached. In other words, many people dampen the positive. Picked up from parents and other relations and ourselves, if we feel positive, we don't trust it. We think this can't last. You know, if we're excited about something, we better not, if our child is excited about something, we tend to say, we worry that they might be disappointed. Child comes in and says, I've been picked for the football team. I've been picked for the school team. And you think, I hope it goes well. I hope he's picked next week as well. And, and it's really difficult to prevent ourselves from trying to dampen expectations to avoid disappointment. But you end up just dampening all the time. But let's just take a couple more questions and then we'll get to the feeling tone meditation because we've I don't want to lose the questions that we're getting in. So over to Vishwapani. Okay, muted.
Okay, basic error there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's see what questions we have. Okay, don't have any new questions. I just want to go back a step. We haven't mentioned frame by frame yet.
Okay.
And I'm interested also why you think this particular intervention, this particular approach, is the thing that you have chosen to put your time into in order to build on MBCT and Frantic World and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that might help everyone on the call make the connection with why this is important for us.
Yeah. Well, because what MBCT did for mental health was to take the brilliant insights of John Kabat-Zinn in relation to physical health, chronic pain especially, to the pain of mental afflictions. And so the adaptations that were made to MBSR, because it's basically the same framework as MBSR. MBSR is the stem cell, as it were. MBCT was the first offshoot, not I think the first, but one of the earliest. And it's saying that the real thing that you need to worry about in mental health is brooding and rumination and worry. That's repetitive negative thoughts, as Ed Watkins calls them. And that's what drives mood down and down and down. So ways in which you can release yourself from that. That's why we sit earlier, have longer sittings earlier in MBCT than we do in MBSR. And we didn't major on the yoga. John Kabat-Zinn majored on the yoga because that brings people very early face to face with the problems in their body and their relationship with their body. We wanted to bring people just as early to the problems that people have with their mind, spinning. And so we put sitting earlier in order to give people the experience of actually being spun round and then seeing if that spinning could slow and you could start to see gaps. Now, for me, the feeling tone is an extension of exactly that. It's a way of resting for a while at the very point in which a cascade of another worry is either continued or prolonged. And so that's, I think, the magic of the feeling tone work. And of course, it's the second foundation of mindfulness. Frame by frame, I mean, it's been called various things in its life history. It was just taught on retreat as feeling tone to start with, but then it became known as frame by frame when we did a taster course. The analogy there is with Edward Mayberg, who was the first photographer in the 1870s to use his 12 cameras on Palo Alto race course to determine whether when a horse was galloping, its feet all left the ground at the same time. Artists hadn't seen it because horses are galloping too fast. So artists had various solutions to how to depict a galloping horse. Photography allowed it to happen, but you needed 12 cameras, each with a little string across the race course. And as the horse raced past, it actually broke the string, and at a thousandths of a second, each one was set. When he developed them, the answer was, as everybody knows, I think, that yes, there's a point when the horse's hooves are the horse is flying, basically. The horse's hooves all off the ground. Now, the frame by frame, therefore, is the idea, can you slow your mind down in that way, frame by frame? Because to see where the point where on that frame, you get a feeling tone frame. Now, in fact, then the editors of the book didn't like frame by frame, and we were going to call it the feeling tone. So it was going to be called, the book was called The Feeling Tone. And then another editor said, you know what? Nobody will know what that means until they open the book. You want a title that actually will intrigue people enough to at least get it off the shelves. And so they called it Deeper Mindfulness, and that's what it's going to be called. deeper mindfulness, but inside it's called the Feeling Tone Program. But
the course that you launched last year,
yeah,
through the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, is called Frame by Frame.
And we'll probably leave that to be called Frame by Frame, because that was a taster version of the course that's actually now in the book. So the book is the full course, and that's what people learn, and that's what the Oxford Mindfulness Centre teachers have learned to teach. And yeah, so, and I think it's probably still called Mindfulness Frame by Frame on Oxford Mindfulness website, but I think they're going to change it to Deeper Mindfulness, the Feeling Tone course or something. So what's in a name?
All right.
Everything. But
good, we got that clear.
Good.
But all these terms have been used in advertising.
And I know, I'm sorry.
It's good to get it. And there will be a book.
Yeah.
And we'll look forward to that. When's it being published?
May the 25th.
May the 25th. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I've put that on the resources sheet, which you can send around. Yeah.
We'll send that out with the email at the end.
Yeah.
So let's keep going.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we're going to get through your entire agenda.
Okay.
But let's, we've got another 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So over to you, Mark.
Okay. So why don't we, I'll just do a bit of science and then I'll do a practice. So one way, when you actually, if we could literally do an Edward Mayberg and slow the mind down, you would see, if you like, frame by frame. In other words, you'd see the building of a succession of mental models in the mind. But we now know from predictive coding that it would be a bit different from Mayberg's cameras, because every camera was actually getting actual data from the world. And I mean, there's an equivalent of Mayberg you can do now with your iPhone, which is you keep the camera button pressed down and it takes what's called a photo burst. So you actually do a Mayberg, and my dear mother-in-law keeps pushing it by mistake and ending up with 15 photographs of her lap or 15 photographs of the opposite wall. And so the series of mental models that we are constructing in our heads moment by moment, very fast, are like that frame by frame. The difference here is, let's imagine that the first frame was based on data. But we now know that predictive coding kicks in, and predictive coding will take that data and create a mental model out of it based on your past conditioning. So what happens is there's a moving apart of a virtual stream and the actual data stream. And if the data coming, as it were, bottom up is not precise enough or strong enough to interrupt this virtual data stream, then your virtual data stream that you're constructing, your mental models, will be your experience. So, and interestingly, only when you make an error, usually, do you notice it. So if you're walking on the street, you see the white line at the edge of the curb, you go to step down, and we've all had this experience where it's only a white line, it's not a curb. So you stumble. But you feel like a fool because you've stumbled over nothing, because it wasn't a curb, yeah? And so you notice, oh, and you correct yourself, and hopefully you don't fall and you will go on your way. But at that moment, you had to wake up. You had to adjust your posture. But the interesting thing about that is this, that if it had been a curb, you'd have stepped down perfectly normally. You wouldn't have even been aware, as it were, of stepping down. Your stepping down would be part of your virtual model supplied by your prediction, not part of what's coming from the senses. The senses have given you enough to see there's a curb there, you've predicted it, you've done everything you need to do, and you walk on your way. And actually, unless you're doing mindful walking, generally, we know our feet are touching the ground when we walk, but actually that's not actual data from our feet. It's virtual data generated by our predictive model. And that goes for a lot of things. So the mental models, the direction of travel, the urgency of them, and whether they get tainted by negativity or positivity is determined by the feeling tones, both of that original data, but also of the models being created by our conditioning. So with that sort of basic science, let's perhaps do a short feeling tone meditation, and we'll both notice the feeling tone as we did with the objects in the room, but now we're going to refer to our own body and things coming up in the mind, and then we're going to move to see whether we can allow them to be as they are. So coming to sit. And starting this short practice by choosing your anchor, choosing the place where you'll come back to if your mind gets too distracted or confused. Maybe the feet, or the contact with seat, or the hands, or the breath, or some combination. Just making that choice now and just resting here for a while with your anchors. Then at a certain point, expanding to the whole body, the entire body sitting here. From the crown of the head to the bottom of the feet and right out to the surface of the skin. And as we do so, noticing what sensations are present. What's prominent. Maybe something in the background. And as we notice the sensations, see if it's possible to be aware of their feeling tone. Is this sensation pleasant or unpleasant or somewhere in between, neither one or the other? The sensations and the feeling tone may be very subtle. So if you can't quite tell, then just let it go and wait for another one to come. No need to go hunting for them, just allowing them to come. A feeling tone is rather like a taste of something. It's not a judgment, it's just a discernment, a sense, a felt sense. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. At a certain point, you might like to expand your attention to take in sounds as well. Sounds inside the body or inside the room or outside. And once again, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. As each one comes, goes. And at a certain point, letting go of the sounds and just noticing any thoughts or feelings that come up, any emotions. And as soon as you become aware of a thought or feeling, just registering its feeling tone. Is it pleasant or unpleasant or somewhere in between? And then resting in awareness, in an open awareness of whatever arises from moment to moment, be it a body sensation, sound, thought, or emotion. And each moment, noticing whatever comes up. Is it pleasant or unpleasant, or neutral? Tuning in to the tonality. And then for a moment, we're just going to extend this practice a little. So whenever something comes up, if it's pleasant, just saying inwardly to yourself, it's okay to like this. Just allowing the feeling tone to be here. If it's pleasant, it's okay to like this. And if anything comes up that's unpleasant, be it a body sensation or a sound or a thought or emotion, saying inwardly, it's okay not to like this. It's natural not to like what's unpleasant. It's okay not to like this. And then coming back to your anchor, feet on the floor or body on the chair, the hands or the breath. And then begin to move fingers and toes and allowing the eyes to open if they've been closed. So once again, we'll open the chat for a minute, and any experiences you notice there, please feel free to put those in the chat. And then we'll have some questions before we finish. So thanking the mind, yes, it's a form of compassion towards the self, and allowing your experience to be as it is without having to use those words, which is a very complicated idea, to allow your experience to be. So it's specific instructions that allow you to free yourself from the tangles without talking about freeing yourself from tangles. And Philip was talking about feeling connected, the reason you're feeling something, bubbles of sensations felt together. Yeah. It is releasing to give sanction to negative feelings. The sense is, you might think, oh, well, gosh, I'm going to get attached to this. But I think there's a sense of, if it's unpleasant, we often blame ourselves for finding it unpleasant. Or actually, it's natural. So it's perfectly fine to say, it's okay not to like this. It's okay not to like this. And yes, it is a lot of decisions to make when you combine 2 whole weeks into a 5-minute practice. So yeah, it does need, I think, opening out, Judith, to do this. Yeah. So the body feeling hot, that's interesting, isn't it? So it can feel like negative, although it's actually moment by moment, Alan. But yeah, it feels, what happens is that one feeling tone tends to cascade throughout the rest. So you can get a series of negative ones, but you can also get a cascade, which is the echo of a peak negative experience, which echoes and cascades through a lot of mental models. So it's worth looking out for that in when you do this practice. Relating to experiences, taste, yeah. And not natural not to like it, absolutely. The sense of the feeling tone is, it can feel like you're asking yourself to make a judgment, but actually it's much more like, say, if somebody threw you a ball, you'd know instantly if it was hard or soft. You wouldn't just go, ooh, hard or soft, you'd know instantly. So although it feels, it feels as if you're judging the tones, it's not actually a judgment, but we can get locked into judgment because we're so good at judging. That's the default option. But through this practice, you cultivate a sense of discernment, which is about tasting rather than judging. Yeah. Well, thank you for all those comments. I'm going to hand back to Vishnupani. So now, would you like Vishnupani to take any further questions that have come up? We can have a final sitting, but we've got about sort of 6 or 7 minutes before that, I guess. You're okay?
Right, I'll get that right one time. I think it would be really helpful if before we finish, we could hear something from you about what you would like us to do with this material.
Okay.
Either as individual practitioners, how you think that we could maybe put this into practice in our own lives, or in terms of the course, or as teachers, and all of that.
Okay.
There's that. There may be some other questions as well.
Okay, well, there is a way of experiencing the course. So I've trained up the Oxford mindfulness teachers in how to teach this course, and they're now doing lots of courses at various times of day and evenings. So people want to hop on one of those courses. If you want to experience the full course, that's fine. That's probably better than just doing the taster course, which is now 2 years old. That's partly developed from that into a full course. If people want to learn to teach it, I'm doing a 1 day in Bangor in September, which is just a day on the science, and then a 2-day retreat, and then a 2-day teacher training. And I've put that on the resources sheet at the bottom. So if people want to train to teach it, they can do it themselves, experience the course themselves, but then train to teach it, which is a 2-day teacher training after a 2-day retreat after a 1-day science day. And you can do the science day by itself, or the science day and 2-day retreat. But if you want to do the teacher training, I think we're asking people to come to the other things as well. So that's what people say when they've done the course, when they've experienced the course, is that they find it leaking, whether they learn to teach it or not as a follow-on course, they find that the ideas and practices leak into their own teaching of mindfulness. And experience of mindfulness. They take it on board in their practices, as I find myself very helpful to do. And then if you're a mindfulness teacher, it's inevitable that some of the practices will modify how you normally teach SR, MBCT, or one of the other mindfulness programs. But it's up to choose. If people are interested and intrigued, then I do invite you to taste the course for yourself and see what your experience is, and then make a judgment thereafter about what to do next.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, it's such a rich area of practice, isn't it? It's almost, no, I've been on retreat, and I suppose when I was starting to explore mindfulness approaches, and just realizing that there's this whole phenomenon going on all the time. In my experience, I'm constantly liking, disliking, or feeling neutral. And that's subtly different from what I knew about, which is getting excited about things and getting fed up with things and getting bored and all of that.
Yeah.
Behind that, there was something else going on.
Yeah.
And that's in Buddhist settings, we call it Vedana. That translates as feeling tone.
Yeah.
I am. Yeah, all right. What's your experience been teaching this to people, presumably coming off 8-week courses, or maybe with a little bit more?
Yeah,
because it's subtle.
Yeah, well, the experience is that at first people say, "Oh, what's new about this?" Because if we spend the first two, I'll answer Philip's question in a moment. Maybe if you reflect it back, Vishwapani. That. The sense of grounding, a lot of people are doing trauma sensitive mindfulness anyway, so they know about changing ground. It's a little bit new for people to start thanking their mind, and there are analogies we use about the metaphor of wandering into a gym and finding no gym equipment. You'd be pretty miffed if you paid for a gym membership and there was no equipment there. So and the gym equipment in mindfulness training is actually all your memories and daydreams and stuff like that. That's what we practice on. So if your mind didn't wander, you get no practice. It might be very calming, but actually the calming, it can be a snare and a delusion in mindfulness, because we think when we get calm in a mindfulness sitting, oh, this must be it. This is what I'm looking for. This is surely enlightenment. And actually, we're probably half asleep. That's why we're feeling so calm. And so with the practice of mindfulness is how to relate to the mind. That's the critical thing about what we learn on the cushion. and that takes time, and we go in one direction. So I think but when people meet the kindness to the mind, and then with that attitude of kindness, curiosity, that is resources they need to look at this very, very thin sliver of experience we call Vedana, or feeling tone. And you're absolutely right. It stands at the beginning and behind all the other cascades. We normally don't see it clearly, so it pushes and pulls us around. And it's really simple. In other words, when we're in the midst of saying we feel angry with somebody, we can get so consumed with the angry. What about just saying this is unpleasant? And it's okay not to like it. And then we feel depressed and sad about something, or concerned or worried. What about saying, oh, that's unpleasant too? And it's okay not to like it. And that seems like, well, that's really, that can't deal with your anxiety and your wonder and your anger and your worry. I say, try it. It's extraordinary. And you begin to discover that what you thought was driving your emotion had missed an important frame in that series of frames. It missed the Vedana. And if you start to not to miss it, and then to allow it, then it can transform things.
Okay, so that we do have more questions.
Okay.
How does this fit with fight, flight, and freeze? You could say, how does it fit with moving towards the unpleasant as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, how does it fit with fight and freeze? Or it's basically noticing the thing that happens before you do all of those things. So if you think of a single-celled creature, a bacterium or an amoeba, you know, the things you learned about in biology, they needed to know what was toxic and what was nourishing. They needed a mechanism for moving towards the nourishing and moving away from the toxic. Not exactly fight, flight, and freeze, but some molecular signal that would move them one way or the other. For an amoeba, it's a little thing on the top that waves and moves them around. And that is so deep in our consciousness, in our evolutionary consciousness, as it were, but it's before we even make the decision. It's that sense of affective judgment. This is something that's unpleasant, or this is something that's pleasant. Yeah.
Right. I think we have to wrap up. So it's so interesting, this subject, I think, because on the one hand, it's subtle. And on the other hand, as you've kept saying, it's so incredibly simple.
Yeah.
And our minds and our presumably our brains are mysterious and complex. But at the same time, there's this driving phenomenon that behind all of the proliferating complexity of our experience that is so simple.
Yeah.
If only we can see it. Yeah. So I feel really grateful again to you for highlighting it and reminding me of that layer of my experience, which is so fundamental, which is really rather like an amoeba. You know, I like to think of myself as an educated person, but on one level, I'm not even, we're going quite a long way back. We
are going quite a long way back, absolutely.
Yeah. And if we can understand the amoeba within and learn to love it, then a lot of the rest will make sense.
Yeah.
So it just seems so interesting that this is how you've chosen to build on Finding Peace in a Frantic World and MBCT. Mm-hmm. And I think this will have a big effect on all of the work that all of us are doing.
Yeah.
The materials that you mentioned, the resources, I've copied into the chat, so you can copy them, paste them. Then we will be sending them out to everyone. Really hope that the book goes well. I should just remind everyone, this is what Mark is doing in his retirement. One of the many things that he's doing in his retirement. Again, really appreciate how much you give to the mindfulness world, how much you give to the world of mental health, and how, really just everything you've given over the years.
Thank you so much. It's really a real pleasure to be able to come and speak especially to something which is so close to my heart in terms of where I'm going in my work, but also to come back to Wales. And yeah, we'll all, as Charlie said, learn to love the amoeba within.
Yeah, learn to love the amoeba. We didn't manage to get you to speak about Wales. That's my one disappointment about this session. But thank you very much. And we're going to finish there.
Okay, thanks everybody. And thank you as well for hosting it. Yeah.